Making the Climate Case for Freshwater Action. My name is James Dalton. I'm the head of the Water and Wetland Management Team based in IUCN's headquarters in Switzerland. I'm actually chairing this right now from an airport lounge, so apologies if there is any noise in the background. This webinar is hosted by WINS, the Water Initiative for Net Zero. WINS aims to promote water's role in solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to ensure climate resilient development. It is a network of individuals and institutions designed to really elevate the role of water in climate mitigation. We have an exciting hour ahead of us with some different partners to speak through some of the issues and things that they're working on. And I don't want to sort of take too much of the time that they will have. Thanks very much. There is the agenda up front. So we'll have a short chat from myself, and then we'll have two presentations and a moderated panel discussion. The protection, conservation, and restoration of freshwater systems is critical to slow climate change. In the push for solutions, we are often missing the most obvious one that is sitting right in front of us, which is our natural ecosystems, in particular peatland systems and mangroves and wetlands. Peatlands alone can store the same emissions as we emit each year from the airline industry and the shipping industry combined. That's about 4% of global emissions. And that's lost each year due to the degradation of peatlands. So there are some major opportunities ahead here for us to actually conserve, restore, and protect these freshwater systems. They are unique, but they're also very highly valued because of the water security that they do offer to society. They're often sources of water for utilities, or they may be sources of water for communities, and they form part of the broader freshwater ecosystem network that exists in our river basins. But they are starkly missing from most of the nationally determined contribution plans and the national adaptation plans by countries. Consequently, we are not taking forward the opportunity to invest in these natural systems, and we are missing the point in many ways that whilst we look to invest in technological solutions, there's no harm in doing that, but we still should also be investing in the natural systems that are giving us easy wins from a climate change mitigation perspective. We're also going to hear a little bit about the Freshwater Challenge. We're going to talk a little bit about that later on in the session, which is an initiative that aims to support, integrate, and accelerate the restoration of 300,000 kilometers of degraded rivers and 350 million hectares of degraded wetlands. By pushing for these targets, the aim is not just to improve water security, not just to improve river flow, not just to improve biodiversity, but to also improve the storage, the natural storage of carbon in our freshwater ecosystems. Now, I have probably said enough. I think it's probably best that I hand over to one of our great speakers to start with. I'd like to introduce first my friend and colleague Ian Harrison. Ian works for Conservation International. He's done lots of research on marine and freshwater fish all over the world. He is a freshwater specialist for Conservation International's Moore Centre for Science. He's also served as the technical officer for IUCN specialist fish groups on the Species Survival Commission, and he is part of the IUCN Freshwater Conservation Committee. He's also, I note, the Associate Director of the Free Flowing Rivers Laboratory at Northern Arizona University, and he's based in Arizona. Ian, I hope that you're there. Yes, I can see you. I'll hand it over to you, and I'm assuming someone will put your slides up for you.
I am just about to do that. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so you should be able to see my screen okay, hopefully. Thanks very much, James. So I'm going. Oh, let me put this into. Sorry, into. Oh, there we go. That's better. So I'm going to start my presentation by making some statements that you've probably heard many times before from the biodiversity conservation community, and that is that that biodiversity loss is important. It's overlooked, and um, as stated in this paper by Cassio Pereira and others, that the focus on climate change and the specifics of greenhouse gas emissions through things like the IPCC has tended to remove attention away from addressing ecosystem loss and the ongoing biodiversity crisis of species extinction. And they state that efforts should better include biodiversity conservation in policy agendas, that the destruction of ecosystems undermines nature's ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions and protect against extreme weather, so increasing our vulnerability to climate change. And to save the environment, scientists, industries, policymakers, and the wider society urgently need to look at other aspects of ecosystem conservation and restoration as deeply as they look at the climate agenda. And Cassio and his colleagues provided some statistics to show the level of interest, at least via web search data, in climate versus biodiversity as they relate to global policy. And they showed a kind of a flat line for biodiversity below the level of interest for climate. And while I agree with these points that Cassio has made, I think the conservation community have to accept accountability for making some changes happen. If freshwater ecosystems and biodiversity aren't being featured heavily enough in forward planning for climate and environment, then why haven't we managed to make people realize that they're important, and how can we do that? So I'm very happy that Cassio and his colleagues, including me, came up with a paper that starts to address this. It gives some recommendations for actions for conservation of biodiversity that can help address climate change mitigation. And so let's quickly look at a few of these points, particularly as they pertain to fresh water. And the first two on conservation of carbon stocks and sinks and biodiverse restoration are really about ecosystem restoration and conservation to ensure healthy wetland systems that are ecologically functional and capable of supplying their natural benefits. And they're about ensuring ecological connectivity between these systems. And the importance of conserving peatland systems, peat wetlands as critical carbon stocks is widely known. James has mentioned it, and it's been a part of the climate debate in terms of reducing greenhouse gas production. Now, these peatland ecosystems often comprise very specialized and endemic fauna and flora. So any attempts to conserve those species and the ecosystems that support them obviously are also providing a critical climate value. But so peatlands aside, until recently, I think the climate debate's attention to water has been more in terms of ensuring water security for people than about functioning freshwater ecosystems. But that is definitely changing. The climate COP28 is an example of that. Uh, where there was an advance in the treatment of freshwater ecosystems in that climate discussion. And Razan Al Mubarak, who's the high-level champion for climate high-level champion for COP28 and IUCN president, had stated that we know that healthy freshwater ecosystems are central to global efforts to adapt these impacts and to build long-term resilience. The climate crisis is a water crisis. And there were some other important statements that came out of COP28. The global stock take decision recognizes the critical role of protecting, conserving, and restoring water systems and water-related ecosystems. The United Arab Emirates framework for global climate resilience includes freshwater and biodiversity-focused targets, noting that focusing on reducing climate impacts on ecosystems and biodiversity, including through restoration and conservation and protection of inland water ecosystems. And part of this, of the driving force of bringing freshwater ecosystems into the discussions at COP was because of the support given by the COP for the Freshwater Challenge, which James mentioned in the introduction, and we'll talk about the Freshwater Challenge more in the panel. Part of the result of COP28 was that we now have 46 countries supporting the Freshwater Challenge as well as the EU. So just to emphasize, by addressing the requirements of ensuring ecosystems are healthy, where the biodiversity is conserved, the ecosystems are functioning well, and providing natural benefits, we're addressing some important climate mitigation goals as well. So on Cassio's points 2 and 3 on biodiverse restoration and integrated conservation of local fauna and flora, he's talking about addressing this biodiversity, conserving biodiversity in the ecosystems. And this partly is drawing on points raised in this paper by Schmitz et al. On trophic rewilding. They took the well-recognized idea that natural climate solutions can have this ancillary benefit of protecting habitat and conserving species. And they turned this around and said that actually the conservation of species can itself be a key component of natural climate solutions by capturing carbon. The freshwater example they gave was for beavers, the number 12 that you can see up in the kind of the global north there, which have a pretty large global population. And while there are various estimates of net carbon sink and source effects from beaver action, the general feeling is that they are effective at ecosystem restoration, managing flows, retaining water in ecosystems, that's acting as climate mitigation, reducing fire risk, and so on. Now, diadromous species that migrate between marine and freshwater are another example of climate relevance like this. Salmonids transport significant amounts of carbon from marine to freshwater and terrestrial ecosystems. And thinking about fishes, let's discuss inland fisheries. Now, healthy rivers and wetlands also support inland fisheries. In fact, areas of high freshwater biodiversity richness have been shown, unsurprisingly, to have higher yielding inland fisheries. And when these inland fisheries are well managed, they represent important sources of protein for hundreds of millions of people, and they're responsible food sources, as they have lower environmental costs than the production of other animal protein. And in particular, inland fisheries, especially small scale and artisanal fisheries, can have a lower carbon footprint because they're both harvested, marketed, and consumed locally. So again, restoration of freshwater ecosystems supporting well-managed inland fisheries represents an important aspect of climate mitigation. And you can see from this slide, from a study from 2020 by Abby Lynch and various partners, that clearly inland fisheries cut across multiple sustainable development goals on the topics we've been discussing: biodiversity conservation, food security, livelihoods, water services, climate resilience. And these are topics that are also obviously picked up in other MEA processes, like the Global Biodiversity Framework and the Paris Climate Agreement, but others besides. And I mention this because to bring us back to another point from Cassio's paper, this point 6 of joint biodiversity climate COPs, of the idea of linking up MEA agreements and their objectives. And this is important. It's something that we've been looking at in the Freshwater Challenge. Through 2023, we were advancing the challenge through the climate agreement process because COP28 was our opportunity to bring countries together to recognize that freshwater ecosystem restoration and conservation is climate relevant. And we did this successfully. And when we brought representatives of about 30 countries together at IUCN HQ in Switzerland at the end of May, that's the photo on the left there, to discuss the Freshwater Challenge, we asked them to mark up their areas of policy interest on this kind of chart on the right. And there was general interest across the range of policies, but in particular SDGs, the Global Biodiversity Framework. And so on this point of having sort of the Freshwater Challenge as this kind of ring around the policy, something that kind of can unite interests and feed into policies together. This is something that we've been presenting to our colleagues, our country partners, for the challenge. We've been saying that the challenge is important because rivers, lakes, and other wetlands are the front lines of climate and nature crises. But the key role of healthy freshwater ecosystems is recognized across these multiple different MEAs that you see here. But we know that progress towards water-related targets is really off track. Water is often considered only as a commodity, not as an ecosystem, as I've been saying in this presentation. And so we need national plans and strategies to really do better at a more quantified and geographically specific set of commitments. And what we want to do is to connect the dots between these existing agreements, and build on what is already present, and not duplicate what's already there. So I'm at time, and I'll stop there. So thanks very much.
That's great. Thanks very much, Ian. Thanks for giving us that overview and that introduction in terms of using the science relating species and conservation into the climate discussion, and then bringing it back to sustainable development as well, and the real challenges that we face. So really appreciate that. We'll look forward to having some questions for you on the panel. If we can now bring up the next speaker, please. Jenna, are you there? Are you able to join us? Excellent. There we go. So welcome, Jenna. Jenna Gami is the director of Forest Trends Water Initiative, which aims to scale up incentives and economic tools that recognize the value of nature and upstream communities in assuring secure and safe water. Jenna has worked on forest carbon project development, climate policy analysis, strategic communications with McKinsey, and holds a master's in environmental policy and regulation from the London School of Economics. Very glad to have you here with us, Jenna, and you're going to talk to us a little bit about the work that you're ongoing right now in terms of looking at finance. So I think we're all interested to know, after Ian has sort of set the scientific base for us, what does this mean in terms of where's the investment happening, and is there enough? So I'll hand over to you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, James, and thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to share with you all today. I am getting over a little cold, so I hope my voice will hold up, but please bear with me if anything happens. So as James mentioned, I'm going to be focusing on one aspect of our work at Forest Trends, which is what we do to track environmental markets and conservation finance. And I'll primarily focus on the tracking that we have done and that we are updating this year to see how much investment is flowing into nature-based solutions based on objectives for water security. As part of that, we'll look at kind of the role that co-benefits have played in these program designs and in motivating finance. So we have done a series of these reports that have been called the State of Watershed Investments. The last report that we published was in 2016, looking at 2015 data. So one of the things I'll tell you about at the end of the call is that we're updating this report this year, and we would really love the help of everybody on the call in making sure that the report is as robust as possible. We really depend on survey respondents in order to provide a robust assessment of the market, and we think it's needed right now. But let me first tell you about what we found in 2015, so you have a sense of what this market looks like, of big picture market of overall investments flowing to nature for water. So what we tracked in the report published in 2016, which is based on 2015 data, is that global investments in nature for water had been steadily increasing, and they were about $25 billion in 2015. At the time, we grouped the main types of investment mechanisms into 4 different types, kind of based on an assessment of why the payers were involved. Were they trying to create more public benefits or more benefits to more water users, or a kind of flip side of that is to be able to compensate for water use, so kind of offsetting either water quality or water quantity impacts of water users. And also we looked at kind of how market-like. Was it very transactional, more credit-based, or was it less transactional and credit-based? And we came up with these 4 types. So one is public subsidies for watershed protection. These could look like big farm bill programs or other types of big public finance. This far and away leads the category and accounts for the bulk of the investment. Then we have user-driven watershed investments. This is the next biggest category. These are usually more in a watershed scale, some private sector participation, local municipalities, water utilities, sort of in that group. In-stream buybacks is the use of water rights markets where users or payers will purchase credits to allow water to remain in stream. That's the next biggest market, although it's concentrated in certain geographies. And then we have water quality trading and offsets, which are usually regulated programs, even more concentrated geographically, but an important and continuous part of the market. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what we found in each of these. And starting with the public finance, I mean, here really the bulk of what we found was in China. China has been investing in nature for water and big public programs for many years. So that's always a big part of the story. There are also big, usually subsidy style programs from national governments in the US and in the EU that drive this part of what we find in the finance. Then we have user-driven investment. So as I mentioned, this is a smaller but growing part of what we're seeing in investment, led again in China, in Asia, also lots of programs, so a lot of kind of activity, although less finance in this area in Latin America compared to other regions, and a good amount happening in North America. For trading and offsets, so this is mostly water quality trading programs, usually driven by kind of state level regulation, similar regulatory schemes that encourage or that require polluters to offset their impacts. And they might buy credits, for example, from farmers who implement best management practices to reduce nutrient pollution, for example. So we found that these, they're very dependent on what's happening with the regulation in general, growing after a slump. And then the in-stream buybacks was more popular in Australia and in the US. As I mentioned, these are based in areas where there's already a robust market to trade water rights. And so usually conservation groups, sometimes private sector companies would be able to buy water credits and then not use them, leave them in the stream in order to support in-stream flows. So I wanted to just say something quickly also about what was motivating these buyers based on the data that we could collect for the 2016 report and how this connects to what we're talking about today, which is the contribution of water to the climate crisis, specifically on the mitigation side. And what we found was actually not that much alignment in the 2016 report. So it will be interesting to see if this is an area that's changed. So, and there's two ways to look at this. So the first way I want to look at it is, what did our respondents say were the most important things driving the payment from the payers, the source of the finance? And what we can see is that really it was more driven by the buyer's operations, by more of the water related objectives. The programs need to be able to respond effectively as a nature-based solution to a clearly defined problem or goal that the buyer has, and it's mostly focused on water. Co-benefits motivated some buyers, not very many that we were able to collect data on, and biodiversity seemed to be more important than something like carbon sequestration or storage, which only 3% of buyers said, or we only found with about 3% of buyers were important at the time, almost 10 years ago. The other way of looking at this is from the point of view of the programs. Are they designing for co-benefits? And even if a buyer isn't motivated by a co-benefit, they might be doing it because they think they might be able to get funding based on that co-benefit in the future, or because it's important to the integrity of the project itself. And there we have more respondents indicating that carbon is a motivating or is an important co-benefit, or at least that they're recognizing that this is a benefit that is being created by their programs. So as I've mentioned a few times, the report that I was just showing you the findings from today was published in 2016. It's an important benchmark globally to really have a quantitative sense of what is actually happening in the space. We know that since that time, the interest and kind of the overall discourse on nature-based solutions for water, for climate has grown a lot. We don't know, at least, how much is that actually translating to more investment on the ground. So that's what we hope to be able to show this year. Excuse me. So the report this year is going to look at how much is being invested, where investment's happening, what interventions on the ground are supported by those investments, how are local communities participating in the investments, who are the dominant and emerging investors or payers, what financial mechanisms are facilitating investment, and what are the key motivations driving investment. So I'd like to extend a warm invitation, as I mentioned at the top, to everybody on the call to help us. We're collecting data now. We're in the final stretch, so we really encourage you to get the data in. This is a joint effort that we are doing with the Nature Conservancy and with the support of a great advisory group that includes a lot of the people on this call, like James and Agua, John at Agua, and others. You can enter the QR code to find the link to the survey, or just reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to connect you. And the final thing I wanted to say is just, one other thing that we do at Forest Trends, we have a program called Ecosystem Marketplace, which tracks the voluntary carbon market. They've just put out a new report. If you want to get a sense of what is happening on that space, is kind of a different set of environmental finance that can motivate investment in the same types of interventions that we're talking about today. I reached out to them to see if we could do an analysis of how much of what they're tracking is actually also linked to water objectives or actors in the water market. And that's something they could do, but just with the timing, we weren't able to pull something together today. But I just wanted to make sure you all had this as a resource. The report is available freely to everybody, and I hope you can check it out. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Jenna, for that. That's great. So whilst everyone just absorbs some of the information they've just taken on board from yourself and from Ian, let's see if we can assemble the panel. If we can get Ian and Christine on the camera as well, that would be great. Excellent. So whilst Ian turns up, let me just introduce Christine to everybody online. Christine is the head of policy for freshwater at WWF International. She joined WWF International in 2022. She's worked in Europe and Africa on water policy and law development, and has a lot of experience in building community public-private partnerships for water resilience. And you also led WWF's freshwater program in South Africa for 9 years, if I'm not mistaken, Christine, as well. So excellent to have you with us. So we're going to sort of jump straight into some questions just to get some information flowing whilst we wait for the audience to sort of give us their opportunities to ask questions as well. So if anyone does have questions, please throw them into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen there, and then we will take them as they come in. Christine, we heard a little bit from Ian about the Freshwater Challenge. I briefly mentioned it. Maybe you just want to give us sort of, quick sort of 30-second overview over what exactly that is, just to let people know who don't know anything about that. And linked to that, there's a question that's sort of sitting with me. Ian's told us about the science and how that's the sort of real foundation of things, in the sense that we're recognizing the role of the natural system more. Jenna's talked to us about looking at where the financial opportunities are and how much finance has been mobilized. I suppose the question to you is, are you seeing that finance, is it the rubber that hits the road? Are you seeing it on the ground and that capital being mobilized, or is it sitting in the wrong place?
Thanks, James. Thanks for the introduction and the challenging question. First of all, just on the Freshwater Challenge, yeah, I think Ian gave us a really nice overview. This is something that was launched as part of the Water Action Agenda at the UN Water Conference in 2023, and then had a huge growth spurt at COP28. So from the initial 6 countries that launched it, we now have 45 countries who are members, and the EU has also recently joined. So it is a member-led, a country-led initiative, and we've been working with a group of supporting partners Conservation International, WWF, IUCN, UNEP, Wetlands International, TNC, and UNCCD, in really trying to pull this thing together and meet the really ambitious aim that it has, which is really the biggest kind of global freshwater ecosystem restoration and protection initiative. And we're particularly focused on restoration. And we have a very ambitious goal of supporting countries to restore 300,000 kilometers of rivers and 350 million hectares of wetlands as well. So that equates to the kind of 30 by 30 target 2 under the global biodiversity framework. And I guess the big issue is, and what we've heard from both Jenna and Ian today, is that the climate crisis is a water crisis, and a huge part of the water crisis is the state of degradation of the freshwater ecosystems that are really the resource base for our future water security. So this is what that challenge is trying to address. It's trying to address it at scale, and it's trying to work with the countries that are really in the front lines of the climate crisis, make sure that there's much faster learning and knowledge sharing between the countries themselves, and then from ourselves as supporting agencies, how do we help to mobilize the knowledge, the resources, the right policies, everything that's needed to get this going. But to your question, James, about, we've seen, and so I'm really looking forward to the next report coming out from Forest Trends as well, and also participating with you guys in this final drafting. It's such important information. But at the moment, I think what we're seeing from Jenna's figures as well is that the finance that's being put towards particularly river and wetland restoration is a fraction of what's needed. And we're also seeing that, in terms of adaptation finance at the moment, that is still a fraction of what we're seeing going into overall climate finance. So estimates of less than 10% of overall climate finance at the moment is for adaptation. So I guess the good news about that is that there's hopefully a road ahead of us that is going to open up and is going to bring more adaptation finance into green infrastructure, into restoring the state of rivers and wetlands through nature-based solutions and other mechanisms of protection and enhancement. And I think, there's a lot to learn. For instance, for forests, we have seen some countries benefiting from the finance that's available for mitigation and in the carbon markets. So, the big question is adaptation finance going to do the same thing for rivers and wetlands, given that much of the climate crisis is a water crisis, and these are the ecosystems that are in the front lines there. And that's what we would really like to try and accelerate with the Freshwater Challenge, because at the moment, we're coming back to the old saying of winning slowly is the same as losing. And in terms of the race to resilience, we are absolutely losing, because we're seeing these small pieces of the jigsaw coming together way, way too slowly. And that's why we want to work with this really strong coalition of the willing in the Freshwater Challenge. And look to support countries in terms of how do we get the right policies in place, how do we redirect the right subsidies to be flowing in the right direction. And it's not just about finding additional finance to then pay into green infrastructure within the water sector, but it's also about a massive paradigm shift towards really internalizing the true costs of our economic and social development, and ensuring that we're not continually asset stripping from our natural capital as we've done pretty much up until now.
Great. Thanks, Christine. So, yeah, no, I mean, some really great points there. So, we've got some questions coming on the Q&A, and actually people are actually looking at answering some of the questions themselves, which is fantastic. So there's a couple here, and I'm going to sort of raise them now, and maybe Ian, Jenna, you might want to sort of tackle these ones as well. So There's a question from somebody joining from the US who's interested to hear about what's the sort of most impactful action that state, province level policymakers could take to incorporate freshwater into climate action. So it's a pretty broad, big question, but there's also a question coming from people as well, asking what are the sort of easy nature-based solutions that agriculture could adopt as well that would actually have an improvement in improving freshwater, but also potentially having a climate benefit as well. So I wonder if you guys want to have a think about that in terms of what that might, what frustration in terms of from one person's question here that they can't get this investment in freshwater from the state's climate work, and that actually water isn't seen as a climate, something for climate to invest in. I don't know if you guys want to have a go at that, Ian or Jenna.
I'm happy to have a quick comment on the state action level. I mean, I think that is and my answer is not going to be a very good one in terms of it's going to be more saying yes. I think this actually is a very good point that needs to be raised. That that is a challenge, is getting the the water agenda into state thinking, and I think it's part of the answer to that maybe goes to this the point that's been raised of looking at the value of water beyond of the water and the ecosystems beyond the commodity of the water itself, and actually being able to present that value in a more complete way, in a more comprehensive way, which then requires, I think, the input from multiple different stakeholders and rights holders in those areas who are working with those different elements of water value and water use, sort of beyond the water itself, but the ecological value, the service, the multiple different service values, and get some of those dialogues going a bit better than they already are, and kind of sharing that information, and kind of, we're a bit siloed in the way we're thinking about this. So that's my initial thought, which isn't really much of a solution, but that's just what immediately comes to mind.
Yeah, no, but whilst Jenna, please do unmute if you want to add to that. But I think it's an important point, in because you said at the beginning that science has challenged that climate is that our environment is losing out due to climate change. But actually, what your subsequent research and that of others has found out that actually the natural system is part of the climate solution, and water is key to that. And so there's been this flip, this change. But I think operationalizing that science into policymakers' thinking and understanding, and then taking that into an investment space, is probably still a track and a journey that we're still on. But Jenna, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but also just there is another question specifically for you, Jenna, as well, which I think is relevant to this. It asks about if Forest Trends is analyzing the demand side for investment to see why user-driven watershed investments are not picking up the opportunities to address local and regional needs. I don't know if you want to sort of wrap that into your response as well.
Sure. So, and I think that aligns also with what I was thinking for these sort of subnational policy drivers. So I think just sort of based on our experience, what we've seen and what we've heard in earlier survey respondents, one of the biggest barriers pointed out by respondents in the last survey was regulatory uncertainty. So if there are changes in laws that are driving water actors to have to compensate for their impacts on water quality or water quantity, it's important for that to be clear to actors so that they can invest in these types of projects. So investing in nature-based solutions often requires kind of new technical skills. You might need to hire new people in your institution, find new partners. So you need to have a sense that it's going to help you. If you're trying to do it for a compliance reason, you need to understand the rules of the game. So that's important. And of course, we don't do that overnight, but recognizing that that's a barrier, and recognizing one of the new institutions that need to come into this. I love this kind of pie chart with the Freshwater Challenge and how we're looking at across all of the different conventions, how we connect to these ideas of nature-based solutions, climate, and biodiversity. I think when we bring that to the ground and we look at the actors that need to be involved, we'll begin to see maybe some of the reasons why we don't see as much collaboration on the ground because of policy barriers that could be easily removed, honestly, without even creating a big risk for ensuring that we're still using funds well. Like a big example we see all the time is that water utilities might be interested in investing upstream in the wetlands or the forests of their watershed, but it's outside of their jurisdiction. And just kind of allowing it to be clearly an option for them to invest in, and they would still need to justify it and the logic that they justify all of their investments. But just kind of making it clear that it's not only allowed, but it's encouraged for them to be looking upstream would make a big difference. So thinking about sort of, and just you can find that out pretty quickly when you start talking to people and you ask sort of, have you thought about this? Does it seem like something within your realm, and begin to find these barriers? And the other thing I think that's a big trend coming online more and more is disclosure, partly driven by kind of, standards on the finance side, but even, implementation of the, commitments at the COPs that are now requiring different sectors to report on. For example, water utilities now having to report on their carbon footprints and actually thinking about that aspect of it. And so therefore, increasingly also thinking about opportunities that they might have to reduce those footprints, not only in their operations, but, in synergy with other efforts they might have in their watersheds. So I think that's all important. And then so those kinds of drivers, hopefully we will also get a sense of from the qualitative responses that we have in the survey. So we really encourage you all, if you see kind of changes in policy, could be national, subnational, even corporate policy that seem like drivers of change and investment for nature-based solutions for water. We'd love that input through the survey, as that is part of our outlook. But that's sort of the best way that we get a sense of what's happening on the demand side. Because what we'll be reporting on this year is really like what has been implemented up to 2023. So we really get a sense of not sort of aspiration, but what's actually happening, which we think is valuable to be able to track, the trends over time.
Yeah, no, that's great, Jenna, actually to have that data, and we know that study hasn't been done for a while yet, so we're all looking forward to seeing what that tells us. Now we've got quite a few more questions in, and there are some fantastic ones. So I'm going to hand one over to you, Christine, but Ian and Jenna, please do weigh in on it. This is quite specific to the Freshwater Challenge, and it combines a few questions. So to start with, the question is around how is the challenge looking at the aggregate co-benefits of restoration. So in terms of looking at the mitigation angle, as well as the adaptation angle. And of course, there's the biodiversity and water security angle. So just a bit of a question about that as well, and understanding how climate funding could actually help to bridge that gap. Linked to that is a question about if there's any market research done on how to better engage communities who have a real desire to invest in their natural systems and to mobilize action on the ground to get local actions really moving. And then a third question, which is sort of at a higher level from a policy perspective, is what's the sort of best type of fit for purpose initiative that could be put forward at COP29 to further strengthen the Freshwater Challenge and take it further? It is something that is accelerating, and that's fantastic. But what's the sort of thing that COP29 maybe needs to look at as well for that? So I think probably the first one to come to is you, Christine, and there's quite a lot in there. So I'll hand over to you.
That's a lot. Yeah. That's a lot. I'll just touch briefly on those three areas. Yeah, I think the restoration challenge is something that's very exciting for scientists in this area, as well as for the modelers and the economists as well. So to start looking at how do we model for optimization and prioritization of wetlands and rivers and any other freshwater ecosystems based on a range of co-benefits. And those might also shift, depending on where you are, in the semi-arid areas, water storage is going to be an absolute priority, whereas in other areas, recovery of biodiversity in nature depleted countries, recovery of biodiversity might be more of a priority. So that is definitely a knowledge practice gap that still exists, and the countries are coming to the supporting partners and saying, how do we do this? How do we prioritize? How do we have a national scale strategy and plan that optimizes the rivers and wetlands that we want to invest money in restoring, that are going to yield the best benefits for water security and climate resilience and biodiversity in the long term? So that is a big question, and that's a very exciting area of work that we're starting to look at as well. And that's kind of the big scale, and then coming down to the smaller scale about engaging local communities. I don't think I've ever worked on any kind of river or wetland restoration that hasn't included local communities. They're absolutely the key. We are absolutely the key ingredient to that. So whether I now live in the UK, and we have very active local communities around wild swimming and using rivers recreationally, that's sort of pushing the envelope on water quality demands for rivers and better management. And then, in other countries, it's more about having basic resources available to be converted into water supplies as well. So making sure that these things touch the ground and do include local communities, and what local communities need to get from their local rivers, wetlands, and aquifers is really critical. And then just very briefly on the COP29 question, I think that's something that together we're working towards now, and love to join up with any of you who have some inroads to Azerbaijan. But obviously the focus of this COP is going to be very much on finance. So making sure that we build on the acknowledgement of the importance of freshwater ecosystems for adaptation, and how do we get that explicitly drawn in to finance for adaptation, and an opening up of some of those mechanisms that are going to allow that to happen, and start opening public and private new sources of finance for freshwater ecosystem restoration is going to be really critical. I think that's something that's got to be in our crosshairs for this COP.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think linked to that, there's a question here about political will. We're talking about this sort of multiple sectors, if you like. We're talking about multiple issues. We're talking about the problems with climate, water security challenges, biodiversity loss, etc. And I think in the past, we've sort of, every sector has tried to deal with them or ignore those problems at their own peril or at their will. Do you all feel that there is a greater sort of understanding of the fundamental foundational baseline of the natural system here in providing these services? Are we going to sort of see that increase in resources going in and financing, or are we still struggling with this lack of political opportunity and lack of political will? If you've got 45 countries in the European Union sitting around the table, as we had recently, Christine, for the Freshwater Challenge meeting, does that not demonstrate political will, or is that just, are we not getting the money and the actual action behind it really moving as well?
I think it demonstrates a degree of political will, but it doesn't yet demonstrate political muscle. And actually, we need to have a much stronger and much more joined up political will that isn't just coming from Department of Environment or a Department of Water Resources, but is also overlapping strongly with Treasury, and the bigger development ministries as well, the more powerhouse ministries. And then we need to see the action on the ground backing that up. And frankly, in the UK, we've got elections coming up next week. I'm not seeing anything impressive in any of the manifestos from all the political parties that are standing. I know that we've recently come out of the COVID crisis and there are lots of things that need fixing. But the fact that nature is fundamentally broken and is our life support system is still not high enough up on the agenda. And we saw, tens of thousands of people pouring into London last weekend to demonstrate around nature and urge government and the next government to fix this. But it really doesn't feel as though government's taking it seriously enough. So I think there's still a huge amount of work to be done there. But then converting that will to muscle in time is absolutely critical as well.
Yeah, no, great point. So let's just on the investment side, linked to that, then, if we need political muscle for that, we either need to see investment flowing or decisions to make investment flow. And there's one good question here, which has got multiple parts to it. So I won't come back to you with all of the parts of it, but one thing that's interesting is they're asking about the investment and what you're going to find out in your survey, Jenna, in the next sort of report. But there's also a question about, is there an estimate of what is needed? Do we actually know what we really need from an investment perspective for natural systems? And do we understand exactly what nature-based solutions require from a cost perspective, right? We're not talking about hard infrastructure here. We're talking about more dynamic systems that take time to accrue benefits and they devalue in a different way. So they need to be invested in and operated in a different way. So I wondered if are there numbers around that?
Yeah, I loved that question in the chat. I don't have an answer to it, but I've noted that we'll do a little bit of research to see if we can include it in the report to see if folks have come up with that. I don't think there's one overall number, but there's certainly a lot more experience now about how much it costs to develop and implement these programs. A sense of kind of the amount of coverage that's needed, either in restoration or in ensuring protection and good management of ecosystems and, say, a source watershed in order to perceive benefits at the watershed scale. So I think we could come up with a sort of estimate. But I also would maybe caution about that, just because kind of to go back to the last point and to maybe draw some lessons from other sectors. A lot of it is about how much can we commit to investment directly in these things and to, restoring and managing ecosystems for these multiple benefits. But a lot of it is also on the kind of defense and avoiding investments moving ahead that would damage and degrade these ecosystems. A lot of pressure from the agricultural sector, which receives, a huge amount of investment in most countries, especially compared to the water sector, or compared certainly to the environmental sector, is a lot of times, unfortunately, the driver of degradation on the landscape, when it could actually work really well in synergy to benefit local communities, support food security, and also ensure that we are supporting the resilience of those systems by supporting the landscape around it that supports it. And I'm starting to see similarly, just the climate transition to net zero, bringing on a lot of new technologies that could easily, have a lot of impact on natural infrastructure, on the landscape, that I hope that we are also paying attention to, so that, we know that conserving, protecting ecosystems that are actively providing these services is the most cost-effective thing that we could do. So, sometimes those efforts are invisibilized when we just focus on how much are we mobilizing directly into new projects. So they're both sides are really important, and I promise we'll follow up on that question to see if we can get a better answer of kind of estimates of actually what's needed.
Thanks, Janet. Yeah, some great questions. So one then for you, in which goes back, I think, right back to the beginning with your presentation, is that the scientists were questioning the role of environment with climate, and here we are, ended up with understanding that actually it's fundamental. It is part of the system. Are we seeing science move at the pace that we need to see, and the investment in science and research to really help answer some of the questions that we've had today, for example? And what is investing in that type of work also desperately needed, because we're going to face questions that we can't answer going forward for sure. And as climate takes effect on some of these natural systems, we're not quite sure how they will respond. So I wondered sort of, what's the thinking on that in terms of, are we seeing that type of practical applied but longer term thinking in some of these ecosystems come out to the front in a sort of communicable way to try and cross those silos that we tend to create for ourselves and speak to multiple sectors, but also speak to investors as well?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think, I think that the science is actually moving along very well. I mean, I think there's a lot of good science that's happening. I mean, within my organization, within CI, there's some great science that's happening in terms of uh, looking at opportunities for mapping riparian corridors and looking at opportunities for restoration at the big scale to try and inform more local scale. And the science of that paper, the trophic rewilding paper that I mentioned, is a significant piece of work. Now, whether the funding that's required to support that is in place, that's a different question. I don't think there is enough that, because we're all struggling to run the projects we need to do. I think, and sort of to take this back to a previous point, that I think we also have to be really careful about saying that, oh well, yes, we to answer our problems, we need to do more science, and we need more money to do science. I mean, that's part of the process, but it's not all of it. And now the comments before about, well, how do we kind of bring this to the local level and sort of engage at the local level, get that expertise and advice, I think is also that's where it's going to be important in terms of getting the messaging across, because that's where the kind of the real messages are going to be at an individual at work that's on the ground, and the support of that, I think, is going to be super important. And we have so many good examples of that. I always like to refer to some of Lucy Emerson's work on in the kind of the environmental economics of fresh water, and she has so many great case studies of, like, well, this is how it was done here, and this is how it works, and she gave a talk, and someone said, this is incredible, like, why don't we do more of this? And she had said, exactly, why don't you do more of it? Because it's possible. um, and I think, a lot of this work, I think the investment in the science, but the investment in that community engagement and that local knowledge, super important. Another example I'm thinking of, a talk by Azam Alwash talking about the reflooding of the Mesopotamian marshes. They had this huge project, a very high science project of modeling the marshes, the hydrology of the marshes, trying to work out exactly what to do right. Very complex. But what was interesting in his presentation, a lot of money went into that. What was interesting about his presentation was that he said, ultimately, at the end of the day, they would go out to the local, to the pastoralist communities and say, tell us what this looked like at this time of year 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Tell us what you think it should look like right now compared to what it is. And then they went back to their models and said, okay, well, actually, we need to rework the models because we know a bit better. So I think it's like, yeah, we need the money for the science, but we also, to get back to that previous point, we need to ensure that kind of local knowledge and community engagement is also supported in any projects that are brought forward.
Yeah, that's great, Ian. Thanks very much. I'll just do a little bit of a wrap up there because I realize that we're at the top of the hour. But I think we could keep going because we've got some great questions still sitting there unanswered from the audience. So thank you very much to everyone who sent those questions in. They're fantastic, and we could keep going on that for some time. Just to sort of summarize and wrap that up a little bit, then, I can't help but feel that in many ways we've sort of been here before, in the sense that we know what we need to do, but the difficulty is actually being able to make it happen. And I think it was the term that you used, Christine, is that actually political will is steadily growing, but slowly, and it's patchy. but it's the political muscle and it's the mobilization of action and investment that needs to happen. And we are seeing that, but it's not nowhere near enough, and it's not keeping a pace with the challenges that we face. And maybe it's actually fear. Maybe it's fear in the sense that we're a little bit worried about doing the wrong thing or hedging our bets into natural systems that we don't quite know how they will respond fully yet. So maybe some longer term engagement in the modeling and understanding of response and things like that, and taking some risks, like I think we used to do many years ago. But unfortunately, our systems now are much more about risk management, and therefore we are maybe not challenging our own thinking and understanding and putting science into the right practice. I think the points around scaling science to the right problem and therefore scaling communications as well, so that we're communicating in the right way to the policymakers about what needs to change, is important. And clearly there is a huge opportunity for investment in these systems, but we need to not only just understand what's needed and what that investment looks like, but also what does that investment return to us in terms of goods and services, carbon storage, water security, biodiversity benefits, etc. So there are a huge range of, I think, opportunities and tasks to be done. And I know many of you are all working on it, and many of you, no doubt, in the audience are working on it as well. So I think that, we'll probably I think my closing point is nature the new technology that we've forgotten in many ways, because I think it's something that's sort of suddenly landing on people's desks because we've forgotten how hard it works for us in the background, and we don't recognize how much we've actually managed to degrade it. But at the same times, there is obviously a large amount of work, investment, community to cabinet scaling and possibilities that need to be taken forward. And I think the questions really demonstrate that people are informed of the challenges, but they're also asking the hard questions about how do we actually solve some of these trade-offs that tend to sit between the silos. So I want to thank you all for joining us as audience with some fantastic questions. I want to thank the three of you, Christine, Jenna, and Ian, for being great panelists and presenters. I'd like to thank Josh, Georgette, and Alex in the background, working for AGWA and for WINS, the Water Initiative for Net Zero. And if anyone wants to get in touch with us, please do look us up on LinkedIn or ask the WINS team, and we can try and connect and answer any further questions after the webinar. So with that, thanks very much, and look forward to the next opportunity to talk to you from WINS.
Thanks, James. Thanks.
Thanks, James. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye.